Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. It hasn't been the last couple of weeks I've opened talking about how hectic and intense the week in Israel, politically, diplomatically, security-wise, etc., has been. This week has been certainly a little bit less, partly because we had the holiday of Purim, which in Israel is almost 2 days. There's one day which most of the country celebrates, and there's another day which just Jerusalem celebrates. But obviously, Jerusalem is the capital city. It obviously has an impact and effect on the rest of the country. So we've had a bit of a hiatus, a little bit with some of the intensity, but still behind the scenes, things are moving pretty quickly. The title of this week's webinar was about the coalition, about whether it can survive, because quite simply for a relatively ideologically aligned government, they've certainly hit a lot of bumps in the road already. Going into the elections, this was billed as what in Hebrew is Yamin Maleh, which means a full right wing, in other words, very right wing, and all the parties that make up the government for the first time in many years are all right wing, and in fact, apart from the Likud, are all religious parties. So you would think that there's a certain ideological conformity which would have allowed a certain amount of stability, and as many of the proponents of this coalition predicted, to live out its days. It's not going to live out its days. No government in the history of the state of Israel ever has, and this will not be the exception. In fact, I would predict that the government as it is probably will not be as it is today in a couple of years even, let alone maybe even sooner. Anyway, but going into some of the issues, as I said, it was predicted, and it probably is the most right-wing government ever, but it's also the most demanding. And as we've spoken about in previous weeks or previous months or even previous coalitions, in this one, certainly Netanyahu is probably one of the most moderate voices within it. He's also the most risk-averse. If anyone who has studied Prime Minister Netanyahu's governments in the past, he's not one to make major strides on various issues. It took him quite a number of years. People like to point out that it took Netanyahu many, many years to order any sort of significant or ground invasion of Gaza after repeated attacks from there. On Iran, the talk was always of military action and putting on the table, but according to Ehud Barak, at least, when the option was put on the table, it was not taken up, and on various other issues. Netanyahu is certainly a proponent of a stable government, a government which doesn't make too many jarring moves in any direction, or at least moves slower, let's say, and likes to factor in all the details, whether they are domestic, political, diplomatic, economic, etc. So this government is far from ideal from, I would argue, Netanyahu's point of view, or at least the way it has been, because there isn't this. Sometimes you get a bit of quiet, you get a bit of a cushion at the beginning of a coalition where everyone beds in, everyone looks around and tries to make sure that there's no crises. If there are differences of opinion, they play out behind closed doors, do not play out in the public. Well, this has certainly not been that from the first day. There's been clashes in this coalition, largely because, as I said, it's pretty demanding. You have 2 or even 3 right-wing religious parties which are extremely ideological, and they have issues which they have talked about from outside the government, sometimes in the case of Bezalel Smotrich inside the government, that are very important to them, which are certainly things that Netanyahu is getting calls regularly from the international community from day one, whether it is Jewish rights to prayer on the Temple Mount, whether it is the building of Israeli towns and cities called settlements in Judea and Samaria, known around the world as the West Bank, or even where they sort of meet with the ultra-Orthodox parties on the right of reform or conservative or non-Orthodox elements in Israel, the Kotel plan being the most prominent of those issues. These are things which certainly put Netanyahu and the government as a whole at loggerheads with the international community. What we've seen really is it come to a head, in the next few days when Bezalel Smotrich, the Minister of Finance, one of the top positions in the Israeli government, usually the three top positions in any Israeli government are foreign, defense, and finance minister. And the finance minister will travel to the US, as every finance minister does, to attend the Israel Bonds event, where I'm sure he'll be speaking. But what is most remarkable, and certainly I believe unprecedented, is that he will not have a single meeting with any American officials. In fact, it has now been reported that there'll be no American officials in attendance at the Israel Bonds event, which is also pretty remarkable. It's been reported that Bezalel Smotrich will travel for about 10 days, but it's unclear exactly what he's going to do and who he's going to meet, because there's a lot of uproar about his visit. There's been petitions by more left-wing elements in the Jewish community in America to boycott him, and there was even talk, although I believe it was just that, to even reconsider whether Bezalel Smotrich should even be allowed into America. This comes in the backdrop of Smotrich's comments, where he said Harara, the town, the Palestinian town, where there was a murder of two brothers a week ago, and then, as we know, some of the local settlers from the Israeli towns went and rioted in the town, and he was asked a question what he thought about it, and he said in his opinion it should be wiped out. He walked back those comments. He said he regretted them. He does not believe that, etc., and that was largely because of the pressure placed on Netanyahu by the Americans. They spoke, of outrage, of disturbing, disgusting comments, etc. So, but there's been quite a lot of that. We've seen from the beginning of this government quite a lot of Netanyahu needing to sort of walk back some of the comments, trying to dampen the anger of other officials, whether it was Itamar Ben-Gvir going up on the Temple Mount, or these comments, or some others that have got out. Obviously, the judicial reform issue is also one that he has to explain to his international counterparts quite a lot. But what is also that's sort of was facing inwards. We have Netanyahu really trying to keep order within his government, and we've seen there's quite a lot of issues which have outraged his more right-wing members. Whether it is not removing Khan al-Ahmar, that is a tiny Palestinian, it's no more than a few shacks, but it's in a very strategic, important place just outside Jerusalem on the way to Ma'ale Adumim. Successive governments have promised to demolish it. Interestingly, the Supreme Court of Israel has allowed to, because it said it was illegally built and it has no right to be there, and it has allowed the government to demolish it, but it never has been demolished despite promises to do so. And that has annoyed people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, at the same time as Israeli or Jewish outposts are being removed. So that has obviously caused problems. Then there was the problem with Defense Minister Gallant, who was supposed to, according to coalition agreements, give up certain powers within the defense ministry, again, unprecedented, to Bezalel Smotrich. It took quite a lot of back and forth, but there seems to be some agreement on that. But in the question is not what the agreement is, not what was verbally agreed, not what's in black and white, but what happens in the field, because it still seems that Smotrich does not have full control over the areas which he was promised. And we saw also some of these sort of cracks in the coalition come to a head with the meeting last week in Aqaba, of Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian, and American leaders, where there was an agreement of what, to try and lower tensions ahead of the Ramadan, the holy month for Muslims, which unfortunately usually comes with an uptick in terrorism and tensions here in the region. Apparently, Ben-Gvir, who is the national security minister, and Smotrich, who, as we said, is the finance minister and is a minister within the defense ministry, you would think two ministers who would be very much in the loop, said that they were not in the loop and actually found out about this event through the media. And they certainly wouldn't agree to many of the stipulations and what was agreed to. And they made that very, very clear through social media, etc. So the question is, what happens next? Well, the fact is that Netanyahu, despite these disagreements, despite this unease with some of his partners, still needs them to pass the judicial reform, which for him is a real foundation of being able to move forward on many, many levels, not just on what would be considered boilerplate right-wing issues, but also on other issues like getting Aryeh Deri back into the cabinet, which is very important, maybe passing laws which will stifle the criminal proceedings against him. There's quite a lot in there which Netanyahu himself would like, more at least as much as some of his partners want in the judicial reform infrastructure, which is being moved forward. But when all that gets passed in whatever form it is, and I'll get to what's happening there in a second, there is a very distinct possibility, and I've mentioned this before, and I still hear it from all quarters of the Knesset, whether the left, the right, the opposition, the coalition, that at some point, Benny Gantz's National Unity Party is very much seen as a replacement for at least some of the more extreme right-wing elements in this government. We spoke last week about probably one of the closest people to Netanyahu, Natan Eshel, putting out a bit of a trial balloon for the media to say, if we're going to compromise on this, then shouldn't Gantz and Lapid be interested or at least move towards entering the government? And the fact that such a central person to Netanyahu would say such a thing also speaks to something a little bit deeper. Moving on to the proposal for judicial reform, while the Knesset schedule is really moving ahead, Simcha Rotman has basically packed his schedule as the chairman of the Knesset Law, Judicial and Constitutional Committee, packed with meetings really to try and drive forward his agenda to get as much done on the judicial reform as possible before the break in the Knesset, which is April 2nd for the Pesach holiday, the Passover holiday. They've said for quite a while that they really want to pass the major laws before that. And so they're going to really need to move at not breakneck speed necessarily, but a very heightened speed. So part is a threat and partly because procedurally that's what he would need to do. It seems that even while there is talk of talks, conversations, compromises, the schedule for the vital committee in the Knesset that will move things forward is being driven at a very fast pace. It did come out in the last day or so that there is a proposal on the table for some sort of compromise by former Justice Minister Daniel Friedman and a few other people, some of them associated with the protest movement, some former security officials, which would certainly move the needle back towards the current situation, far from the current situation, because it would deal with all the different issues, whether it's the override or whether it's the judicial appointments, which are obviously two of the most important parts of the judicial reform. But what they are sort of trying to see where the government is prepared to compromise. Now, what's interesting is that while this is a private initiative by certain individuals, judicial experts, et cetera, it has not been embraced, at least publicly, by the leaders of the opposition. The leaders of the opposition have said they are absolutely unacceptable. They go too far towards the government position. The government, on the other hand, has actually embraced them a lot more. One of the people very close to Netanyahu, the cabinet secretary, Fuchs, basically said it's a very useful jumping off point for talks, but as is still too far from our positions. But it's clear that the government, at least Netanyahu circle, does want some level of compromise. He's certainly not happy with what he's hearing from multiple, banks, from unicorn high-tech companies who are removing their money, from very senior or even rank and file soldiers who said that they will refuse orders to be conscripted or to do the annual when they serve the army every year, and it is really getting out of hand a little bit. And Netanyahu certainly, although he's not allowed to because of his interests in the criminal and the justice system, because of his criminal proceedings, he's legally not allowed to get involved. But it's clear behind the scenes he is trying to slow the process down, trying to listen to voices, has been meeting with the president, and is open at least to some sort of compromise. What we are going to see tomorrow is another day of anger, of shutdowns. There's talk of shutting down the airport. Tomorrow, Prime Minister Netanyahu flies out to Italy for the weekend, and there's talk of shutting down the airport for as much as possible. It probably won't affect Netanyahu because he obviously has access to a helicopter which can fly him straight into the airport and over the heads of those who will block the roads. But it's clear that it's going to be another day of what the protesters call shutdown in Israel, where they will shut down various arteries around the country. As I said, the airport is going to be one of them. The main Ayalon highway in and out of Tel Aviv was the scene last week of quite intense, I wouldn't say violence. There was a certain amount of violence and there was a certain amount of injuries. But it's clear that the protest movement is not interested at this point in stepping back. It's really trying to push full ahead. And finally, because of that, it's having an effect also on Israel's diplomatic and security relations, because US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is supposed to come in tonight to Israel and then leave tomorrow. In the end, he's coming in tomorrow and he's going to have a briefing at a place very, very near the airport. Now, obviously, no one in the government is saying it's because of a protest, but it's clear that these sort of briefings, these sort of meetings do not take place where they are scheduled to take place. So they are having an impact, the protests. It just remains to be seen exactly what will happen, because there is interest to climb down a little bit from the government, but how far they'll go and whether this will be accepted, not just from the opposition benches, but also from the protest movement as a whole. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right, thank you so much. So the first one we have is from Elaine and Kenneth Leiter. Is the U.S. State Department involved in the organizing and financing of the current demonstrations against the judicial reforms?
Well, there's no suggestions that they are, and I would highly doubt that they are. There's certainly, as in most protest movements, whether on the left or right, there is some foreign funding, but it's usually NGO, it's usually private individuals. It's clear that there's some funding going on in the protest movement, but I would certainly, I've never seen any suggestion, and I don't think it's really possible, even if there was, to find such things of any U.S. State Department involvement.
Thank you. Stuart Broad actually comments on the NGO part. Good evening, Mr. Perry. I dare say that only a tiny percentage of Americans, including American Jews, have any knowledge or appreciation of Prime Minister Netanyahu's pragmatic and cautious approach to the critical issues confronting Israel. There seems to be just below the surface an important component of NGO action against Netanyahu and Israel itself coming from the left-wing NGOs in the U.S., with tacit support by the Biden administration and the Democrats. Do you agree?
That's quite a lot to agree or disagree to, but I'll try and deal with some of the elements. I mean, there is a lot of money that comes in abroad for all sorts of elements, whether it's left wing or even right wing. A lot of settlements are built with foreign funding, a lot of right wing organizations, but obviously the left wing is far more funded, and that's why in previous years or in previous governments, there's been a lot of attempts by the right wing to try and pass legislation, if not necessary to limit this funding, to at least make it more open and transparent. There has been some success there, but there's always ways around it. And there's not really that much interest amongst the rank and file Israelis exactly where the money comes from, at least to a certain extent. Again, it's something which rails the right far more than the left. But yeah, I think, if you look at the composition of American Jewry, the vast majority are on the left, vote Democrat, are progressive religiously, politically. So it makes sense that that they would also be more interested to fund movements that fit their worldview. There are obviously prominent Jews on the left and the right, which are funding constantly the issues which most matter to them. But I don't think there's any particular sort of conspiracy of people getting together. I'm sure there are elements within the Democratic Party which are very happy with what's going on, would like to see greater involvement, and perhaps are cheering it on the sidelines, as we've seen. And the fact that, as I said, a very senior Israeli minister is coming into the US in the coming days and will not be met by a single senior official in the US, again, is pretty unprecedented. And I think in there is not so much to send a message to the minister himself, but it's trying to send a message to Israelis that this, we do not accept this. We do not accept these positions, these ideologies, these statements. And so if you care about the relationship between America and Israel, these are not the sort of people you should be voting for. I think that's probably the message that the Americans are trying to get across.
Thank you. Jack Berkowitz asks, putting aside the necessity of judicial reform for now, do you believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu is starting to regret that this matter was placed on the agenda first and foremost, rather than having waited for a more strategic opportunity?
Well, there's a number of elements here. First of all, I believe it's got away from him. The people who are leading this are Yariv Levin, the Justice Minister, and Simcha Rotman, as we spoke about, and they are very passionate about this. This for them is something, especially Simcha Rotman. He's written books about this. He started an NGO about this. I've spoken to him many, many occasions. He is deeply passionate and believes in the righteousness of this reform. And he is gung-ho. He will move ahead as quickly as possible. What we are hearing is that Netanyahu is trying to slow things down, at least with Yariv Levin, because Yariv Levin is probably, arguably, the more moderate of the two, and also the more powerful of the two, even though Simcha Rotman, as I said, he has his hands on the most important committee in the Knesset for these issues, and he's moving, full steam ahead. Probably what he does regret is the antagonism towards it. Perhaps it could have been done in a quieter way, although at the end of the day, what happens in the Knesset usually isn't felt by the people, but the protest movements and the opposition, which is supportive of that, has done a very good job in caricaturizing what the judicial reform is: anti-democratic, authoritarian, moving us towards dictatorship, all these sort of buzzwords which we're hearing and seeing all day. And again, I would argue that 95% of Israelis, wherever they come down on the political ideological map, probably don't understand or know the exact issues and debating on it. So it's now, sort of branded as, are you a Democrat? Then you support the protests against, and if you're anti-democratic. So probably I would suggest that Netanyahu is a very strong communicator, is a great strategist, a political strategist, probably regrets the way that this is being branded, especially as it is being, demonstrated around the world. I'm sure he would probably prefer to have got out a little bit ahead and tried to explain it in slightly different language and make sure that the voices of the opposition were not the only ones out there, because at the moment, the government, the coalition, is doing a pretty poor job of explaining their viewpoint, in contradistinction to these loud noises which we hear daily on our screens, on the streets, that this is about the soul of Israel's soul, the future of Israel's democracy, which clearly it's quite extreme. But again, to anyone who runs a campaign, you need to you need to talk about, what is the perception rather than reality. And the perception is that Israel, as a former Treasury Secretary in the US said on Israeli TV today, that Israel is on the edge of a cliff, and it's it could get to a situation where it will take actions where it will just not be able to recover from. I think that's a little bit extreme, personally, but that is what is being said, and stated again on our screens, on our streets, etc.
Thank you so much. And going back to our first question about the State Department, Mr. Pipe sent over an article. I have not had a chance to read it yet, but it does look like the State Department has funded left-wing groups behind protests against Netanyahu. Okay, just a fun fact.
It's possible. It's possible indirectly. In the past, certainly there are. I should correct myself. Is there an intention specifically to fund these organizations? I think, first of all, this has happened so quickly, but certainly the State Department, as many foreign ministries around the world, have and are funding left-wing Israeli organizations, and some of those Israeli organizations are involved, usually those who are more left-wing on the political and diplomatic agenda, vis-a-vis the Palestinians, who have also got involved with these protests. But I don't think that there's necessarily a causal link to the funding, just because it's relatively new. That's the main reason.
Thank you so much. Rod Margolis asks, what is your prediction on how long the current government will last?
As I said, I'd be very surprised if the government in its current form will continue. Certainly, it won't end its days. As I said, no Israeli government has, and this isn't going to be the exception. Certainly, with all the noise, as I've said, the governments which last the longest usually have a good 2 years of calm, and I don't think we've seen 2 weeks of calm in this government. So I don't think that really speaks too much. And as I said, the fact that not everybody, but many people in the Knesset, on the left and the right, coalition opposition, all talk about a time clock where Benny Gantz will come in, shows that there's something to it. And the fact that, again, we've seen in the actions, and I didn't even talk about, again, the budget, which is supposed to be coming out, which there's still no formal agreement because of the excessive demands of pretty much every minister in the government. They all want to have their portion. They all believe that their ministry and the areas and that they're working on and what they believe in are essential, and they need a very high budget. But at the moment, the demands are far greater than what's actually available. And the fact that there was no agreement at this stage even on the initial budget presentation also does not speak so well to the longevity of this government.
Thank you so much. Ken Miller asked, actually, this was last week and I kept it, but he said, with the change of the execution law for terrorists, what do you believe the international reaction will be following the first actual execution, assuming that it's fully passed? And Barak Korkmaz follows up with, does this move feed the apartheid claim on Israel?
Having the death penalty? I mean, there are other nations around the world, including the US, which have the death penalty, and I don't think that's necessarily anything to do with apartheid. Will it feed into the anti-Israel agenda? Well, pretty much anything feeds into. When Israel has the largest LGBTQ parade in the whole Middle East, it's seen as, what's it called, pink washing. So anything Israel does will, those who want to find it, that will feed into that narrative that Israel is racist, Nazi, apartheid, etc. Nothing good or nothing bad will ever sort of change those minds. The death penalty for terrorists, again, I would stress that today it is possible for a terrorist to receive the death penalty. It's just never happened. It has to be a unanimous decision by a bench. The full bench has to unanimously agree to it, and it simply never happened. On a few occasions, there has been there's been some dissenting opinions which believe certain ghastly and gruesome mass murders by terrorists do deserve the death penalty, but the majority won out in all of these situations. I believe, and I'm not 100% sure, I haven't seen the text itself, but I know from previous attempts that that the difference is to basically make the majority smaller. So there can be, you don't need, or just to make it majority rather than unanimous decision. And that would allow for certain, if we look back in history, then there would only be a few who would actually meet those criteria. It could be that once this law is passed, maybe the justices themselves would be more averse to finding someone applicable for the death penalty. So it's very hard to say what the reaction will be, because we're so far from even passing the law, let alone actually initiating the first terrorists who will meet the criteria of the death penalty. So I think it's a little bit premature to talk about that.
Thank you so much. So we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Benjamin Weinthal discussing Iran's shifting relations with Europe. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.